we should try to seek out truth and try to share truth. And not my truth, your truth, or somebody else's truth. And I understand the sentiment behind that, because people experience certain things and that becomes their real truth that we've never experienced. But there's a certain basis of truth when it comes to science and medicine. Let's ditch the quick fix and dive into today's conversation.
Let's switch gears a little bit and go into the big conversation, or a big conversation, which is COVID. So You've become, in my mind, pretty highly educated about COVID. You've been doing a lot of research over the last year and a half since it started. So why did you initially, I mean, it's hard to ignore, but what piqued your interest that said, I really need to understand this?
Well, one thing to share is chiropractors are primary care doctors. And so there's two types of primary care doctors: medical doctor, chiropractor. So when people come into my office, by licensure, I need to be able to recognize, diagnose, treat, and or refer, depending on whatever comes into my office. And so we're not, in the state of Washington, able to treat certain things and perform certain procedures. So for example, my training at Western States, I was able to learn about minor surgery, phlebotomy, OBGYN, proctology, genitourinary. Those are things that are outside of my scope of practice in the state of Washington, but I'm familiar with those. And so when anybody comes into my office, they have a certain pain pattern. I need to be able to know, is it something I can treat? Is it something that I can encourage support? Or do I need to refer? So for an example, I've had a couple patients come into my office with severe low back pain, no ability to control their bowel or bladder. That's an immediate, you've got to get in the ambulance, get over to the hospital. This is going to be a surgical thing and you need to get there now, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to colds and flus and things of that nature, my role in my scope of licensure is the opportunity to help people support their immune system. So I'm not going to treat COVID. I'm not going to treat the flu. I'm not going to treat those kinds of things. But if they have something, or if they're concerned about something, about how do they take care of themselves, I'm going to help them support their immune system. So that's been something that, I've been around that particular mindset for 30 years. So when COVID came along, just like everybody else, that first 2 weeks, it was a learning curve. Is this really, what is this? What's going on? What's going to happen? All that kind of stuff. So we didn't change anything. Before COVID showed up, I have these little blocks in my office that you've seen that says, hey, what do you do to prevent the flu or try to support your immune system? So it's on the little poster that I've got in there. Take zinc, garlic, bone broth, elderberry, vitamin C, vitamin D, all those kinds of things. And so my goal when COVID hit was just to encourage people to strengthen their immune system so that they have a stronger response to whatever they come in contact with, whether it be a flu or any other cold virus, which is what the COVID virus really is. And so one of the things that we've just always have done, but in that, I spent a lot of time since then studying, the COVID conversation and keeping up on the COVID conversation. And there's a few resources that I go to and try to follow the CDC studies, try to follow whatever the FDA is sharing, those kinds of things. But ultimately, the resources I trust the most are right now is Children's Health Defense. They do some excellent research work. They do a great job of making sure they understand the information. The Informed Consent Action Network, another great source that I turn to for trying to understand what is the data, what is the data saying. There's some other sources that are controversial, but one that I find helpful. And I think they're trying to do a good job as investigative journalists. That's the High Wire with Del Bigtree. So those are things that I've been keeping my finger on that pulse. And it's to try to help patients, get information. And I'm now treating patients who have had negative reactions to the treatment they've received. So that's been kind of a sad part of this story too.
Yeah. Well, I've been super thankful for just all the education that you've taken in and also provided to me over the last year and a half. It's been really helpful. I hadn't heard the garlic one before, though. And I'm a big, big fan of eating raw garlic, even to the point that my wife has complained about it. Your wife as well. Because if I go and work out after eating too much, you smell a little bit funny. So
it's a great immune stimulation. So for COVID specifically, there's some doctors out there that are sharing really good information and treating. And I appreciate what they're doing, and they're sharing this. And people are familiar with a lot of these things. But one of the things I wasn't familiar with was nebulizing hydrogen peroxide.
Yeah.
And I know Dr. David Brownstein has used that to support the immune system of his patients in Michigan, where you're at. And he's been able to do IV hydrogen peroxide with iodine, supporting it with vitamin D, vitamin A, high dose, those kinds of things. So, we've encouraged people to consider hydrogen peroxide prophylactically, and using the proper, solution ratios and things of that nature. But vitamin D, vitamin C, high doses are really good. Zinc, quercetin, these are very positive things to help stimulate the immune system and fight viruses and those kinds of things. So those, the quercetin, for an example, many people are familiar with this, acts like the hydroxychloroquine does when we consider hydroxychloroquine and zinc. It's just that quercetin is a natural option to hydroxychloroquine. And so quercetin will break the cell wall down, allow zinc to get in and kill the virus. And it's been just well known, zinc kills viruses. I just like to encourage people to consider, the natural route to anything they do. So I always recommend quercetin and zinc. And by licensure, I can't recommend hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or those kind of things. But I have encouraged my patients to seek medical doctors that may be able to identify their need and prescribe, as indicated, those pharmaceuticals, for COVID and any other virus for that matter. So I've really tried to be engaged in this particular difficulty people are facing.
Yeah, and it is important. I mean, because there are people that have pretty adverse reactions to it. Personally, I've already had it. I don't feel at risk for it. Relatively healthy, and I don't feel that for my family either. And that's not just based on my feeling, but that's based on the research out there, and even what the CDC is putting out, or the FDA for that matter. So there's really no point for me to have a vaccine or do any of that kind of stuff, because I already have the antibodies. It's about being immune to COVID, not the vaccine. Everybody is like the vaccine. But what about immunity? Where is that conversation gone? So COVID is clearly a complex phenomenon, but what are some specific things that you would like to pull out and take a look at?
I think one of the first things I've been trying to share is try to get away from the fear, because once you're getting into fear, you're going to increase your vulnerability to getting anything. Trying to raise awareness to there are options for you to take care of yourself, which, like I've just mentioned a few of those, that's really, really important. But I really want people to understand that there is a lot of studies out there that they're not seeing. For example, just recently, the CDC came out and said, we're definitely seeing that the higher transmitters of COVID right now is those that are fully vaccinated. Unfortunately, they haven't studied, what about the naturally immune COVID survivor, meaning somebody like you've had COVID, you survived it, now you've got this robust natural immunity. They haven't studied that. The CDC is supposed to be, studying, what happens in any health concern, and they're not studying that. Well, the studies basically show that that the CDC is not looking at, but others are looking at, that basically somebody that's recovered from COVID can't get the disease more likely than not and will not transmit. Whereas those who have got the vaccine specifically, whether they've had COVID or not, they have become the higher transmitter of the virus, and they can be asymptomatic transmitters as well. And so that's, raises the complexity. And so that's one of the things that's happening. The studies are starting to show, there's hospitals reporting that, hey, now our hospitals are full of patients with COVID that are fully vaccinated. So we're seeing these, signals continue to rise. There's There's a lot of concerns with injury. The VAERS reporting system, vaccine event, adverse event reporting system, showing right now over 18,000 deaths.
By the CDC, right?
And that is that is a CDC function. Yeah. And over 1 million adverse reactions. And the VAERS has some hiccups. Doctors are supposed to be mandated to report. Basically, they don't. Many of them just don't have time, and I feel for them. You're a busy doctor in an ER room taking care of a lot of sick patients with COVID and other things, and you don't have time to sit down and do the report. And when you do sit down to do the report, this is reported by doctors and nurses. When they sit down to do the report, if they're halfway through it and they have to go take care of a patient, they lose. They're not even able to say what they do. So it's become too cumbersome to them to do even the reporting that needs to be done. A Harvard study back in 2010 showed that only 1% of adverse reactions to vaccines are reported to the VAERS system. Mm-hmm. So you can take any number that the VAERS is reporting and say, well, potentially multiply that by 99. At the very minimum, it'd be reasonable to say, even with COVID, you have to multiply that number by 50. So, can we multiply 18,000 by 50? I think that's a reasonable thing to consider. People are being misled to the safety and the effectiveness of this particular strategy. All the while, going back to the fear thing, not realizing that there were and there still are, opportunities to get help from medical doctors that are able to help them on the initial symptom kind of, process. But the other injuries that are kind of really alarming are, the increase in myocarditis in young adult males, is up 25 times what it would typically be seen. It's a signal that I'm surprised that many medical doctors just seem to, dismiss.
Cause for question at the least.
and question. Dr. Gert Vanden Bosch was just in an interview last Thursday, and he's been criticized by a lot of doctors, a lot of talking heads online, because his theory was, hey, this is going to create an even more dangerous variant. And that was about 8 months ago. And sure enough, here we are with a more dangerous variant that you're not going to be able to stop the transmission. And we're not able to stop the transmission with these particular approaches that they've taken. And his big concern now, and it's a big concern I have too, is that children who have a natural immunity that is innate when they're born, and it's pretty darn good, except it doesn't really block the measles virus, and that's a whole different conversation. But other than that, it's a very strong immunity start for kids, and they develop that immunity as they continue to grow. Well, the concern with this particular vaccinating kids is going to eliminate that innate immunity. And his position, Dr. Vanden Bosch's position, is that the kids provide a buffer. And he's not the only one. I've listened to several doctors and read some of the studies that they've put out there on this, that basically, we're going to destroy some of our buffer system that is found in our childhood demographic. So the concerns are many, and I'm just hitting the tips of a lot of concerns at a lot of doctors. If you're familiar with the Great Barrington Declaration, there's thousands of doctors across the planet that are yelling, to say stop.
I know. It's nuts.
It's kind of sad. So one of the things, Mike, I'm really thankful for your, heart to produce this is just to be able to get information out for people so that people can have real, truly informed opportunity for choice. So that, when you go back to the question, why am I interested in COVID? It's not COVID just specifically. COVID's just another virus that we have to deal with. And we need to get information that's solid, not just agenda, coming from an agenda.
Yeah. And to add to that, I don't know if I told you about this, but I kind of looked up how much Pfizer alone has made from the vaccine in 2021. It's $86 billion, and their stock price rose 30% over the year because of the vaccine. So they're at about $115 billion year to date. And that's a really hard number to wrap your mind around. So how I help people to conceptualize that is that means they could fund the war in Afghanistan for about a year and a month or a year and 2 months. So that means they could have funded the entire war in Afghanistan profitably this year alone. For 1 year, sorry, not the entire war, but for 1 year, they could have profitably ran that war. And that's from one company. That's not taking into account any of these other ones, anything like that. And the other thing that I think Shane brought up that was interesting is that they don't have to pay any insurance, any money in case there's an injury. So the government took that over quite a while ago. And the max payout that you can get is $250,000. So if, let's say there's a family of four, so there's two kids and two parents, and just theoretically unlikely, but both the parents die from it. The most that the kids could get from that is $500,000. So it's really just this system that is set up for corruption because there's so much money involved. There's really no risk for the companies, and they're subsidized by the government. So not to get too conspiratorial, but, it is a cause for concern because when money gets involved in these things, it's bad. If there's one thing that you can rely on, is that people are going to act in their own self-interest primarily. I'm not saying that for everybody all the time, but especially when you're looking at these corporations and who's heading them, you're seeing a lot of that. And also I want to mention, there's no judgment on people who've had a vaccine. So if you've had the vaccine, no judgment at all. Like I totally understand why you might feel the need to do that. And this mainstream narrative has been really hard to see through and really hard to understand. And all the social pressure has been very, very difficult.
So I'll give you a little bit of a background on there. Yeah. You're talking about the 1986 Act. And in 1986, Congress came to President Reagan and to submit a bill to hold the pharmaceutical companies indemnifiable to all childhood vaccines. And a little bit of the background on that was the pharmaceutical companies were kind of complaining that for every dollar of profit, they were suffering $20 of downstream liability due to vaccine injuries. And so Congress and the president said, hey, we'll make a safe vaccine. And pharmaceutical companies said, we can't. And that's why Ronald Reagan signed that act in 1986 that holds all vaccine injuries indemnifiable to the pharmaceutical companies and transferred that responsibility over to the government. So there is a government entity for vaccine injuries that's like pulling, hair to get through. But for those that have gone through since 1986, it's paid out over $4 billion for vaccine injuries. And again, it's kind of like the VAERS reporting system. It's very tip of the iceberg kind of reality of how much has been paid out for vaccine injuries. So you fast forward here to COVID, and now we're under this emergency use authorization, and the pharmaceutical companies are, again, held indemnifiable for any of these injuries because of the emergency use authorization. And the new Comirnaty vaccine, once it gets on the childhood schedule, then it becomes indemnifiable. But right now, that's not even getting used. It's still the EUA, Pfizer BioNTech vaccine that's being used. Even though the FDA approved this particular Comirnaty, it's not being used yet because it has to get under a protection. It's not under EUA. It has to get under protection. That's what I understand. That's where I would refer people to the Children's Health Defense, because they've done a lot of study on this. And one more quick note, FDA just requested from the courts to give them 55 years to release the information that they used to make the decision to approve the Comirnaty vaccine. And they want to be able to release the over 320,000 page documents, 500 pages a month. And that's going to take 53 point some odd years. And one more thing that I'd refer people to is, Bobby Kennedy Jr. has just been a great children's health advocate. He just released a book, The Real Anthony Fauci, that I just bought, that I'm just starting to read. But, you said conspiracy. It's not conspiracy.
It's corruption.
There's corruption and there's documentation that supports it. And I know that people think that what we might be saying is some kind of conspiracy, but I just encourage them to check it out for themselves. Go check it out.
Yeah, those are hard pills to swallow. I think for me personally, it came a little bit easier because being in this industry, I see a little bit of the back end of things. And just in my small world, and I'm not even talking about conventional, I'm talking about natural. And even within the natural industry, with relatively small amounts of money, and relatively meaning 10, 20, 30, $100 million, which to these pharma companies is nothing. That's poverty. Right. But even with that kind of money, you're seeing people who are making decisions that are not to help people, but to produce more profit. And so I think it's unwise to assume that people with this kind of power and money are always taking your best interest at heart. And that's, I know, more of a personal anecdote, but I really, really think it's kind of a profit-driven system. I want to go into, because we've been talking about the vaccines, and there's probably quite a few people on this podcast that have gotten it. And if you've listened this long, great, sure. Thank you. But are there ways to kind of detox or to mitigate some of the potential negative side effects from being vaccinated?
There are, and I'm familiar with what some of the doctors are using, like glutathione, molecular hydrogen. There's others, ozone. Is being used by doctors. One of the doctors that, was one of the doctors I interviewed as part of this podcast, Dr. Stephanie McCarter, the Environmental Health Center down in Dallas, they do some specific detox for any reason that you need detox, but that's one of them. Dr. Zandra Botha, I think she's in Europe. She's doing a detox protocol. So there are doctors out there. And I would just reach out to those types of doctors, the American frontline doctors, to work on detox. But some of the detox strategy is the same as some of the health strategy to support your immune system.
Yeah.
Vitamin C, vitamin D, those kinds of things. You can get into activated charcoal. You can get into diatomaceous earth. There's lots of different ways to detox your body. Specifically for COVID, I would have to say, in my understanding, I don't know of a truly tested specific protocol for detoxing from the COVID vaccine. Mm-hmm. It's just one of those things. We have to give time, this opportunity to pass, to be sure. But we do know, just like with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, that they have these tendencies, and so you can use those tendencies to apply to this situation, and then you see how people do with the detox. So, but I would reach out to some of those doctors that are doing detox.
Yeah, very good. I think that's helpful and practical information. So I want to ask a little bit about the podcast. Why did you decide to become a host for this podcast, and what's been your experience up to date?
Well, it's one of those things where you and I, like I said, we've had a relationship now as a family, and now we have a relationship in this venture. You had asked me if I would ever be interested in hosting a podcast, and I said, yeah, I'd be kind of interested in that. And so I had really not pondered the idea of hosting a podcast until you mentioned it. And I appreciated what you were doing with ozone, and sharing the information, the cancer, care, just the overall use of ozone for various conditions that doctors are using, including, muscle pain, joint pain, fractures. I think Lyme's disease, doctors using ozone for. Dr. Brownstein was using ozone in his parking lot in April and March and April of 2020, as he was doing IV hydrogen peroxide and iodine in the parking lot. He was also doing gluteal intramuscular injections of ozone. And so it's pretty amazing, so I was appreciative of that. And I thought, hey, I wouldn't mind being a voice to help people get another voice of information that can help people improve their own health and become better health advocates. And so I was interested for that. And I enjoy it. I enjoy these conversations. I enjoy the conversations I've had with the doctors I've had interviews with. I just have this great feeling they really are out to help people. Sure, they're going to make a living. I'm going to make a living. You're going to make a living. But I really feel that at the core, everybody I've interviewed has this heart to help people and have experienced in many times their own, health issue, and was benefited by some of these options for health. So,
yeah, I've been really excited about the podcast too. And I think once you had said yes, I was like, all right, I got to get this production and this show up and going and make it as good as I possibly can, because I want to support you. So one of the things that we talked about early on, and I said, is I want you to be in total control of the conversations, in total control of the content, because it needs to be your voice that people are hearing, not anything that I'm trying to say, like, hey, maybe you should do it this way. I think that's going to destroy some of the conversation, and that's going to destroy things. So for anybody listening, it's all Damon that's making these conversations, and there's nothing behind it that's doing anything. But so you're entirely in control of these conversations. And what value do you believe we are responsible to deliver to the listeners?
Well, I think at the core, we're supposed to, and I appreciate that. Again, I had no aspiration to become a podcast host. I enjoy podcasts. I enjoy learning and listening, as you know. But I think, at the very foundation of what we do, we should try to seek out truth and try to share truth. And not my truth, your truth, or somebody else's truth. And I understand the sentiment behind that, because people experience certain things and that becomes their real truth that we've never experienced. But there's a certain basis of truth when it comes to science and medicine. And science is always a developing reality. And so we need to share the truth, and the truth as we know it, where we're at, and to try to seek out information from credible doctors, credible scientists, credible, doctors, dentists, naturopaths, environmentally focused, friendly advocates, to help people really see what their exposures are and what their options are. And so I think, again, it's information, it's education. For me, I think that's a really huge foundation that we are challenged by. And we need to be able to strive to do the best we can to get, information out that we know has good basis.
Yeah, I agree with that one 100%. Well, thank you so much, Damon, for joining your own podcast. I really appreciate everything you offer and all this terrific information. I've been listening to, I think I've missed an episode, so I need to catch up on one or two, but I've listened to just about all of them, and I'm going to catch up on the next couple, and they've been fantastic. So I've been super appreciative of the content that you're delivering, and I love you, and it's always great to talk with you.
Hey, I love you too, and have a blessed day, everybody.